Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today we are adumbrating the second part of Chapter 3, Settling the Northern Colonies, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Let's get to it.
Alright, so in 1643, 4 colonies banded together to form the New England Confederation. This was almost all Puritan, and it was still weak, but it was a notable milestone toward American unity. The New England Confederation was formed during the English Civil War, which distracted England and left the colonists to mostly their own resources. The colonies were basically allowed to be semi-autonomous commonwealths. After Charles II was restored to the British throne, he lent his iron hand, but was shocked, on the colonies of course, but was shocked to find out how much his orders were ignored by Massachusetts. As punishment, a sea-to-sea charter was given to Connecticut in 1662, and he gave a different charter to Rhode Island in 1663, which just basically sanctioned their very religiously tolerant government. Finally, in 1684, Massachusetts' charter was revoked as the final blow. Now, Frank, could you tell me, how did England continue to attempt to exert its influence over the colonies?
Absolutely. So we saw how England ended up separating the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the New England Confederation, with its different charters to Rhode Island and the neighboring colonies. However, then it had a change of mind, and it banded them together in 1686 in the Dominion of New England. And this was created to bolster the colonial defense against Indians and tying the colonies closer to Britain by enforcing the hated Navigation Acts. These acts were created to forbid American trade with countries other than Britain, and these were created by Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War, under the economic policy of mercantilism. Alright, so after this, England sends Sir Edmund Andros to oversee the colonies, and he establishes his headquarters in Boston, and he openly shows his association with the Church of England, which, if we remember, is hated by the Puritans. So we're seeing sharp friction between the English and the Americans at this point on two fronts. Economic, with the Navigation Acts, and secondly, religious, because England has the Church of England, whereas America is mostly Puritan. However, Andros responds to his opposition by curbing town meetings, restricting the courts and the press, and revoking all land titles, in addition to passing taxes without the consent of the Americans. At the same time, the people of England staged the Glorious Revolution, instating William and Mary instead of Charles II. As a result, the Dominion of England collapsed. Massachusetts got a new charter in 1691, but this charter allowed all landowners to vote, as opposed to the previous charter, which put the law of voting only to those who were members of the church. So we see a distinct move towards more liberalism at this point.
Yes, so we are going to see that this so hated Andros, promoted the First American Revolution and provided its roots.
This move towards liberalism that we saw in Massachusetts was only possible because it was a period of salutary neglect, which happened because England didn't really care about its little countries in the Americas. It was more concerned with what was happening inside England itself. So, Abe, we've learned about Spain and England, but what about the Netherlands? Were they successful in their colonization efforts?
Yes, so finally in the 17th century, the Netherlands revolted against Spain, who of course were controlling them at the time with the help of Britain, and they gained their independence. So thereafter, the Dutch East India Company was established. It had an army of 10,000 men and a fleet of 190 ships. And basically, the Dutch West India Company, different from the Dutch East India Company, often raided rather than traded, which was its primary purpose. They usually raided the Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean area.
So like Sir Francis Drake?
Yes, exactly. So in 1609, the Dutch hired an English explorer, Henry Hudson, who ventured into the Americas in search of a passageway through them. But instead, he ventured into Delaware and New York Bay and claimed the area for the Netherlands. So he figured out the Hudson River did not go all the way through the Americas, so he claimed those lands for the crown. And then it was the Dutch West India Company that made the great decision of buying Manhattan Island for some worthless amount of money, which was, it was 22,000 acres of the most valuable land and such a tiny amount of money. They also established New Amsterdam, which was a company town, and it was run by the Dutch company for the interest of the stockholders. Okay, there was no interest in religious toleration or freedom of speech. It was just for the interests of the stockholders. The Dutch also gave out what we know as patroonships along the large areas of land along the Hudson River to certain promoters who agreed to settle at least 50 people on each patroonship. New Amsterdam itself had very eclectic demographics because it attracted people of all types and races. There were one French Jesuit counted 18 different languages being spoken. So, Frank, could you tell me, after the Dutch had settled in the New World, did they encounter any issues with their neighbors?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've already learned about how Spain and England have both colonized this area, in addition to the Indians already lived there. So it should be no surprise to anyone that they encounter friction with their neighbors. Indeed, the Dutch settlement was often attacked during Indian raids, and the Dutch responded with simply amplifying their cruelty and counter raids. New England was hostile against Dutch growth also, and the Swedes from Sweden trespassed onto Dutch reserves from 1638 to 1655 and planted their own colonies of New Sweden on the Delaware River, so right in Dutch territory. So we see 3 trespassers right away after the Dutch began to settle. So things got so bad that the Dutch built a massive wall around New Amsterdam, known today as Wall Street. However, in 1664, Charles II of England granted the area to the modern-day New York to his brother, the Duke of York, and that year, British troops landed in the area and so outnumbered the Dutch that the Dutch surrendered without any violence. So the area passed from Netherlands control to British control. However, there is a Dutch legacy left on by the Netherlands settlers in that area. We see that Dutch names still exist, such as Brooklyn, Helgate, and Harlem, in addition to their autocratic spirit they left in New York. Also, such things as waffles, sauerkraut, skating, and golf are part of the legacy of the Dutch settlers who settled New Amsterdam.
So the Dutch left an important mark on the Americas that continues with us today.
Indeed. So wait, tell me, we were looking at New Amsterdam, and that's kind of to the south, but still north of Carolina. Was anything happening to the north of New Amsterdam? Any settlement there?
Yes, so before we address that question, I'd like to talk about the Quakers. The Quakers were called Quakers because they quaked under deep religious emotion. They were offensive to religious and civil rule, and they refused to pay taxes to the Church of England. And they addressed everyone with simple these and thous, thou art, instead of using the conventional titles of people. Basically, they were stubborn and unreasonable, but they were simple, devoted, democratic, and primarily they were against war and violence. They were peaceful people.
Sounds good.
William Penn, he was an Englishman, embraced the Quaker faith when he was around 16 years of age, and he was one of the most notable Quakers. In 1681, he secured an immense grant of fertile land from the King of England, and it was called Pennsylvania, named after William Penn and the Latin word silva, meaning forest. Pennsylvania was the best advertised of all the colonies mainly because of William Penn's notable liberal land policy, which attracted many immigrants because it promised substantial holdings, which were basically large amounts of land. So you could come to Pennsylvania, get large amounts of land. But Frank, could you tell me what was life like out in the colony of Pennsylvania?
Absolutely. So you'd already said how it had a liberal land policy, and this is what attracted many squatters to Pennsylvania, people who didn't really own the land but still were allowed to live there. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania's greatest and biggest city, was more carefully planned than most cities, with wide, beautiful streets reminiscent of Paris or London. Penn bought the land from the Indians for a very cheap amount of money, meaning that there was lots of it to go around, which is what attracted so many people. And his treatment of the Indians was so gentle that Quakers could walk through Indian territory unarmed without fear of being hurt. Compare this to any of the other colonies, which are at this time experiencing intense raids and continuous warfare with the Indian tribes, and we get a feel for just how simple and peaceful these Quakers were. So freedom of worship was available to everyone except for Jews and Catholics, and the death penalty was only for murder and treason. So at this time, it's a fairly liberal area with a fairly liberal set of people. There were no restrictions placed on immigration, and as we talked about, naturalization was made easy. So lots of people are coming to Pennsylvania at this time. The Quakers were also developed a dislike towards slavery, so just another reason to like them more. Pennsylvania attracted a great variety of people from all races, class, and religion, and by 1700, only Virginia was more populous and richer. And though Pennsylvania was fairly liberal, it did have one exception, and that was the Blue Laws. Blue Laws were created by the Quakers, and they kind of forbid people from having fun. They banned gambling, they banned dice games, they banned card playing, they banned excessive hilarity, whatever that is. But for those reasons, we see that Pennsylvania and the two states also founded by the Quakers, New Jersey and Delaware, Pennsylvania's neighbors, began to rise almost as liberal colonies, and yet with some irregularities in them. Alright, Abe, we've been talking a lot about the southern plantation colonies, and we just talked about the colonies that were in the north. But what about these other colonies? The last ones of the 13.
Yeah, so the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. They all had fertile soil and broad expanses of land. All except for Delaware exported lots of grain. There were lots of rivers like the Susquehanna who provided for the transportation of the fur trade in the interior of the land. And these rivers were gentle and they had little cascading waterfalls, easy for transportation. The middle colonies were generally the middle way between New England and the southern plantation states. The golden mean, as Aristotle once said, or as the Latin, aurea mediocritas. Land holdings were generally intermediate in size. The government was not as personalized as New England's personal assemblies, but it was not as dispersed as the southern governments.
Exactly, because we saw that with colonies such as Pennsylvania, we saw more people there, and also, as Abe pointed out, a more diverse demographic of people, more differences between ethnicity, more differences between races, especially in Quaker-founded Pennsylvania. So a considerable amount of economic and social democracy is prevailing here, either from the Quakers or simply from the nature of the populations of the colonies themselves. For example, Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of America, who helped to write our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, imparting those liberal values and democratic ideas, grew up in Philadelphia, the chief city of Pennsylvania, and home to an urban, open atmosphere in the city. So as the American colonies grew older, they weren't any fledgling colonies anymore, they're growing up, the colonists there begin to realize that they're thriving without British help, and they're starting to see that maybe they'd be better on their own. Thank you. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and tune in next time for the first half of Chapter 4, where things start heating up.
Catch you guys next time.